Your company, Colossal, made headlines with the direwolf de-extinction. eGenesis recently gene-edited pig kidneys for human transplants. Does it mean we basically now have a clear line of sight towards doing this in humans?
So I think that's unethical not to do it.
Would Germline be a much easier and cleaner solution which avoids the immune system and delivery complexity?
But there's a bunch of companies now that are trying to do it the right way, and at least whatever countries permit it, people are allowed to graft things onto themselves for whatever reason they want. It could even be people literally expand their minds, expand their cranium to allow more modules to be in suits. It will be used. If it's FDA approved, it will be used widely, just like obesity drugs.
So are you saying the bottleneck is finding use cases, so imagination rather than technology?
It's just a matter of time before we try a million different drugs at once in one patient.
How many years away are we from this de facto 100% accuracy?
We could do it tomorrow.
Harvard professor George Church is a pioneering geneticist behind some of the most ambitious genome engineering efforts of the last 3 decades, from the Human Genome Project to synthetic biology and longevity engineering. Welcome to Accelerate Bio.
Great to be here.
Your company, Colossal, made headlines with the direwolf de-extinction. eGenesis recently gene-edited pig kidneys for human transplants. So I'm curious to know what changed in recent years to make multiplex gene editing in large mammals technically feasible.
Well, probably not much other than deciding to do it, finding applications. I think even pre-CRISPR, we had abilities to do multiplex editing, especially since both the pig and the direwolf were clonal, meaning that we could engineer as much as we want, cell line, and then take the nucleus and transplant it into a surrogate. So CRISPR's a little bit more efficient, but I don't think that was the deciding factor. I think it was mainly just finding a reason to do it that was medically significant in one case and ecologically significant in the other.
So are you saying the bottleneck is finding use cases, so imagination rather than technology?
It's imagination both on the technology and on the side of finding applications. Both of those require some innovation. Even though CRISPR may not have been the deciding factor, multiplex editing was far from obvious, and that predated CRISPR. We've been doing multiplex editing basically since the mid 2000s, and that most groups, if you look at what they're doing, it's 1 or 2 edits. And that's just not going to hack it for these 2 projects. And we kind of looked around for all the things you can do in multiplexing, both for reading and writing and editing and all that. And even for editing, we have maybe 4 different applications. So we've mentioned 2 of them: de-extinction or conservation, ecological, and transplants. But there's also virus resistance. Multiplex editing gets us to virus resistance. And then we can use it for editing repetitive elements. That's also, it's not exactly an application, but in the world, but it's an application in science. So at least 4 things that we've done that require multiplex editing. Oh, aging is another one that's kind of probably will require lots of different genetic changes. Might be done via non-genetic means, but it basically will involve a lot of genes.
Okay. So you're talking about imagination as a bottleneck, but just to dwell on the technology side for a second, I feel like you're being slightly modest here probably. So even if this wasn't like one big breakthrough, what are some of the ingredients that had to come together to make this possible?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was for the transplant, there had been a feeling in the field that you either needed 0 mutations or maybe 1, which was the alpha-1,3 galactoside. There were a lot of people that just wanted that one. There were a lot of groups that felt that eliminating the endogenous retroviruses, which are being produced in every pig tissue and are capable of infecting human cells and replicating there. And even though it seems obvious when I stated this way, it was not only not obvious, it was refuted or attempted to be refuted by almost everybody in the field that you needed to do this. the FDA felt you needed to do that. And so that was our first multiplex edit in the pigs was, somewhere between 62 and 59 edits to get rid of all of the endogenous retroviruses, not just some of them. So that was not obvious. For the conservation, I think it was not obvious that you could bring back extinct alleles to help modern. There's more diversity geographically and in time, going back as far as 2 million years now, than you would get in the bottleneck species that are alive today that are endangered. So I think I think that required some thought. I think that's mostly for those two. I mean, there's a lot of innovation in the other projects too.
So given that we have proven this now in other large mammals, ethical and regulatory concerns aside, does it mean we basically now have a clear line of sight towards doing this in humans?
We can't really put ethics aside, but I know what you're saying. We are working on making human organs. Right now we make human tissues, and those are, that's the product of GC Therapeutics, for example. They have good conversations going on with the FDA and the EMA for some indications there, including aging. So I think that's unethical not to do it, or at least not do it by the standard FDA route, which assures safety and efficacy. If you're saying that what those two projects, pig and wolf, have in common is germline editing, that is, a lot of people have said that they don't like it because it's icky, but they haven't been very specific. So I try to be very specific when I say why there's a challenge there. It's not necessarily forever. We change our minds collectively, societally, on all sorts of things like in vitro fertilization and cell phones and you name it. The main three problems I see is, number one is if germline is inapplicable to the bulk of the human population. 8 billion of us cannot benefit directly with germline the way we could for a lot of new drugs. So that's a market problem. There is the testing problem, which is if you want to, say, cure or prevent Alzheimer's via germline, which at least one company has announced that's its main mission, is to cure Alzheimer's prevent it by germline editing. That's very problematic because the average onset of Alzheimer's is like 80 years old. And so that would be an 80-year clinical trial time, which is expensive and a long time. So that's the second reason. Let's see. I can't remember the third reason right now, but it'll come to me probably by the end of the conversation. Oh, I know. It's that no one has clearly articulated a application for human germline that you can't do already with other methods. I mean, there's some things that you can't do by any method, including germline, and there's some things that you can do by somatic gene therapy or genetic counseling or, regular drugs. But there's no clearly articulated case. Now, all three of those things could change. In principle, you could aim for something earlier onset than Alzheimer's, that for some reason or other you can't treat someone. For example, gamete problems could be something where in order to fix the gamete to make a couple fertile again, you might have to change the germline back to something that everybody else has. That might be an example, but that has not been stated as a goal for anybody publicly yet, as far as I know.
How about systemic changes to metabolism or disease resistance or even aging? I understand you're saying it's likely possible to do it somatically, but doesn't, purely from a technical perspective, germline solve some unique problems here that somatic can't in these complex areas?
So the simple answer is we don't know. Certainly no one has fixed aging very much in germline or somatic. But you're right, that some of the successes in mice have been germline, but mice have such a ridiculously short lifetime that it's not clear how relevant that is. But I can say I personally hope, and I think most people hope, that it can be done somatically because, again, we're past the age of germline. But, everything I see indicates that it's an epigenetic disease that could be fixed by some combination. It may be very complicated, but finally, the medical research establishment is quite capable of very complicated things. You mentioned two of them, the wolf and the pig, but there are a lot of things that are getting increasingly complicated. I think it's going to be a case of polypharmacy, where you need a lot of different drugs at once. Polypharmacy is very common for cancer, infectious microbes and viruses, where you might have 5 drugs at once to make sure they don't wiggle around and escape. But in every age-related disease company I've helped found embraces that, but I haven't seen it embraced by that many other companies right now.
I don't want to sidestep all the risk and ethics, and I have some questions for you about that in a minute. But with my sort of naive lens from a purely kind of engineering perspective, would germline be a much easier and cleaner solution which avoids the immune system and delivery complexity and all of that?
The immune system is a good point because right at our current state of ignorance, we don't know how to make ourselves tolerant to arbitrary gene therapies, cell therapies, protein therapies, etc. We do know how to do it. And if you expose, you could conceivably do it very early, fetal or newborn level without affecting the germline, if that's what the laws require, because that's when you are setting up your immune system for knowing self and non-self and tolerance and all that. We need to crack the tolerance problem anyway, because, there are a lot of people with autoimmune diseases. There's all these transplants, whether they're allogeneic between you and me or xeno transplants between pigs and me. That we need to solve that problem because everybody, essentially almost everybody who's ever gotten a transplant, except for identical twins, gets immune suppressants drugs, which make you slightly more at risk for cancer and infection. So it would be nice to get rid of that, which involves deep knowledge of tolerance. And so working on every way we can think of getting tolerance. The most extreme version is trying to, make organs that are completely histocompatible, changing as many proteins as necessary to make them identical to you. But, we would like to seek things that are maybe a little bit easier, maybe a little bit less expensive. We don't know how. We think this price of all these things is going to drop precipitously because the market is 8 billion people, but there probably will be a difference between completely personalized therapies and more generic ones.
So I understand what you're saying in terms of the current market of 8 billion people for whom it is too late to do germline. And assuming that Somatic will get to widespread adoption first, do you think eventually over time for the next generations, it will unlock the case for germline? And once we have proven that some of these changes are safe with Somatic, we are going to get more comfortable over time to just do these more permanent edits?
I think there are a few things that could open that door. I mean, certainly there are companies that are already, a researcher in China got imprisoned for 3 years for not doing it the right way. But there's a bunch of companies now that are trying to do it the right way in at least whatever countries permit it. But I think the real thing that will change it is a lot of people benefiting from, say, organ transplants that are germline. So they'll realize, the pig organs are healthy. There's nothing particularly wrong with it. That will be one thing. Maybe some assisted reproduction, where people are infertile. That might be another one. I think the overall thing, we're getting better at safety testing for drugs in general. I mean, we just had a case, baby KJ, who went from diagnosis to cure, not just prototype, but cure in 7 months. And so that's partly a testimonial to how fast we're getting at safety and efficacy testing. So all of those things could contribute to it. Another thing might be extreme environments. As we start, populating space and so forth, it could be that our germline is extremely limiting. And so already here, and I've co-authored papers on how certain changes would be either required for healthy living off of the earth or very medically justified. So there's a few things that could loosen this up, but I think we're in the midst of a revolution that is mostly on fixing the 8 billion people that are already alive. Some preventative medicine not yet used, even though they're quite inexpensive and quite ethical. In fact, it's really unethical not to be using them, but we're not using them. And I would say one of those is genetic counseling. That kind of affects the germline, but without doing any germline manipulation. And that's been tested pretty effectively since 1985, but it's only been tested in a tiny fraction, maybe a few million people out of the 8 billion.
So before we wrap up this germline discussion, out of all of those possible use cases, which one do you think, purely probabilistically speaking, is the most likely to become legal or mainstream first?
Maybe restoring function to gametes. For example, there's already a pass on mitochondrial transfer, which is definitely changing the germline, the maternal germline in humans that is acceptable. So in a way, the answer to your question is already done, which is mitochondrial. But for some reason, other people put that in a special category. I don't. I think it's still genetic manipulation of the mother's germline and all her daughters. So I think that's the first one. The second one will probably be some kind of sperm editing to restore fertility in the sperm.
Fair enough. So back to what we are currently doing, you have previously said that vaccines should already be considered human augmentation. Now we have CRISPR therapies in patients. So at what time will society finally admit that we have already entered the era of enhanced humans?
Well, it's not always necessary to force society to admit things. Very often they'll adopt things long before they'll admit things. So for example, people can say, no, vaccines are normal. They're just a variation on what you're getting exposed to every day through your scratches and through your breathing and so forth. You're getting bombarded with a bunch of foreign, poorly characterized organisms. And all vaccines is adding a tiny fraction of that, which is well characterized. So they don't have to admit the vaccines are anything special. And that's, to some extent, that's fine. You vote much more with your wallet than you do at the ballot place or via, social media. The people think they influence because they're influencers, but in fact, it's really the arrival of amazing product that influences more than politicians that influence, social media influencers, in my opinion. So for example, you didn't really need any politicians to help get iPhones and Androids in everybody's pocket. And now you'd lose your job trying to get them away from them. But it's just as radical a technology. I don't think we knew it at the time necessarily, but it's changing society in all kinds of good and not so good ways. But there's no ethical debate over it, really, very little. There was no moratorium on it. There was no, government handouts to help the industry get going, or stay going. So I think that's what we're going to see rather than people admitting something. There'll be no neologisms that protect us, our past denunciations, because we won't be using the same words. We won't say, well, we haven't changed our mind. We just changed our words.
It sounds a bit like the AGI discussion where we just keep shifting the bar so we don't have to confront that it may be happening. So we're basically saying we will be just shifting the definition of what is human enhancement so we don't have to confront the maybe uncomfortable connotations of the term, even though we're already doing things that could be considered that couple of years or a couple of decades ago.
I think especially when you leave the world of biology, there's so many ways we're enhanced relative to our ancestors. I think the way we kind of evade this is we say, oh, well, I'm not enhanced relative to you, we both, but that's not true. There's, even for products that are dropping in price, there's always somebody who's a little, economically disadvantaged enough that they can't get it until you get to something like smallpox where the cost is zero for everybody on the planet. But, most technologies, they require some decision making to join the revolution, even if you agree with it ethically. So we're enhanced with respect to, we don't depend on being able to run fast because we have cars and jets and even rockets. And those are all incredible enhancements. Our ancestors would probably not even be able to understand it right away. We're doing with some of our enhancements, the ability to communicate with anybody in the world instantaneously without having to worry about whether, your long distance call is going to break your budget or something. It's just, you just call and you have access to all the world's information instantly just by talking, now. Thanks to AI, you can get your questions answered. So all of that's enhancement, but we don't have to call it that. We can just call them individually and not recognize the pattern. I think people who do recognize the pattern and do call it out have a slight advantage for producing the next technology or investing properly and so forth. So not everybody else is free to say nothing's changed in the last 100 years in terms of human enhancement.
How about more radical direct enhancements of our biological capabilities? So, for example, you said in a previous interview that in order to cure Alzheimer's, we might have to enhance our cognition so it cancels out degradation. Once we do that, do you think there'll be anything stopping healthy humans adopting the same therapy?
Yeah, I think that's a very likely scenario. And I have mentioned it in the past because I think it's something that we need to start thinking about. Like many of the things I mentioned, sometimes years in advance. Some people say, well, why is he mentioning that stuff? It's not here yet. Well, if you wait until it's here, it's kind of too late to be talking about how we're going to make it equitably distributed, how we're going to decide whether there are unintended consequences and mitigate them. So I think that is a very plausible way of fighting cognitive decline, is by boosting cognition. And some of the mechanisms of boosting cognition in declining individuals will also work in healthy younger people, and it will be used if it's FDA approved. It will be used widely, just like obesity drugs. I mean, they're an incredible medical miracle for heart patients and diabetics and so forth. But most of the people that are using it are probably neither. So this would be similar. And cognitive enhancement could be simple drugs, or it could be caffeinated drinks that have a little bit more boost in them than caffeine, which itself is, some people consider enhancement. Or it could be gene and cell therapy. It could even be people literally expand their minds, expand their cranium to allow more modules to be inserted. I mean, now we're talking further out, but there's no real law against that, right? As long as it's safe and effective. I think it's much less controversial than germline for whatever reason. I mean, it's not necessarily, a mathematical proof that it's less risky or less ethically fraught than germline, but I think in general, people are allowed to graft things onto themselves for whatever reason they want.
Would that be the most likely path to mainstream adoption for whether it's cognitive enhancement or longevity interventions, that they get approved by FDA for treating some diseases, then they prove safe and effective, and due to, let's call it, competitive pressures, other segments of healthy population as well basically get incentivized to follow suit?
I think yes, and I hope yes. I hope that every medical intervention, or whether it's augmentation or not, goes through clinical trials. I think that's extremely good idea. I mean, even for things that are exempt, like nutritional supplements, I think it's very good idea to do clinical trials. But, they're not that cheap, but they're not that expensive either. So I think it's worth it. And especially knowing how they interact, like with other drugs, with various genotypes of humans. I think that's all an important part of it. We're looking for generic drugs, things that would generically help people with various cognitive tasks. It's not like there's going to be one, overarching cognitive task, like being able to multiply large numbers. There's going to be a lot of different things, and it'll be interesting to see how those trials happen.
So clinical trials are obviously the first step, but we are saying those will unlock these enhancements for people with some deficient disease, and that will potentially create competitive pressure for healthy people to also adopt this to enhance themselves.
Probably, yes. Just like GLP is inspiring lots of similar drugs, and even fairly distantly related ones like peptides in general are now getting more scrutiny as a very hopeful direction to go.
What could be, or what is the most likely first genetic enhancement that would reach the GLP-1 moment where healthy people are feeling that it's irrational to not adopt it?
I like to think genetics broadly. So you can have protein therapy, RNA therapy, DNA therapy, cell therapy, and organ therapy. And all of these have a genetic component. Even peptides can be thought of as short gene products, even if they're synthesized by chemical methods. They still represent one of our core biopolymers. So I think in that sense, GLP-1 is the most recent example of something that is augmenting the population. But even if it's preventing them from heart disease and or diabetes, it's still an augmentation in that they can eat foods they shouldn't be eating, that their ancestors should have lived in fear of. They're now less fearful, just like our ancestors lived in fear of 20-some strong pathogens, and we just don't think much about them because we're vaccinated. I think the same thing's true for GLP-1. One of my startup companies called Capable on the West Coast is making GLP-1 for sleep. So they're looking at, many of these things are coming from, a long list that I've maintained for years of potential enhancements. And they're delivering tentatively from peptides, but they could pivot to other modalities, but it's looking very, very promising. So that might be a second example. And there's a long list of possible enhances. And I think peptides are a good way, and gene therapies are interesting because they're in principle once and done. You get it right, you take one dose, and you don't have to worry about compliance, especially if you don't need to worry about keeping out-of-date versions in your home and who knows what. So it's a little more convenient. And also it's a little bit easier to keep it locally. If it has a particular effect on a particular tissue, you may not want it to go to every other tissue. But I think the point is we should think of these as all alternatives where most of my startups that are aiming for a clinical outcome, consider all the ways of doing it, from small molecules all the way up to organs, heavily engineered organs as the way to do the treatment. And it's case by case.
What would be the GLP-1 moment of real somatic human gene editing?
Somatic gene editing. I think aging, that's going to kill 90% of us. And before that, it's going to make us weak, both in body and mind. And so that would be a huge enhancement to have, a 100-year-old that can, run and jump and solve puzzles in the way that a 20-year-old does. So, and we were already seeing gene therapies that have an effect on longevity, at least in preclinical animal trials, like Rejuvenate Bio has 2 triple combinations that look very promising. The OSK Yamanaka factors, it turns out, when delivered intravenously, systemically through the whole body, as far as I know, Rejuvenate Bio is the only one that's shown that actually has a very significant shift to the right Kaplan-Meier survival curve. So that even if it's delivered very late in life, like when half the animals are dead from normal aging, you can still shift double-digit percentages over. So I think that's our first example. It isn't quite in humans yet, but it's moving towards clinical trials. So, especially if that results. So I don't think anybody's done cognitive tests on those engineered animals. This is somatically engineered. But it's possible they're cognitively younger as well as other ones. We've also published on SRSF1, which is a splicing factor, and that one seems to result in reduction in frailty of the whole set of a dozen different frailty indices. Again, I don't think we've tested them for cognition, but that would be an interesting side effect. So in principle, a reversal of aging, can solve a lot of diseases at once, as well as introduce a bunch of augmentations.
Are you saying these aging therapies would be the most impactful ones, or are you saying they are actually the first truly mainstream use cases that will hit the market purely in terms of sequence?
I think a little of each. I think you have to count GLP-1 and sleep peptides that we're working on as probably going to hit sooner and will be widespread. I mean, the closer it gets to total population adoption, the less expensive and therefore the more equitably distributed it is. But yeah, I think it'll be among the first. I doubt that they'll be the first. And they will arguably the most impactful. But I think it's going to be composed of a lot of different things, and it may include, obesity and cancer drugs as part of the cocktail that used to prevent or reverse aging.
And are you saying, so you mentioned metabolic tuning and longevity therapies, are you saying things like cognitive enhancement would likely come later because of increased complexity?
Well, it may have already happened. That, like I said, we haven't tested.
We don't know.
There's a lot, people are very dismissive of genetics for human cognition because when you do, say, GWAS, genome-wide association studies on IQ or standardized tests or, achievements that require intellect in careers, those show very low heritability, and you might have maybe explain 1% of the population variance. But that's kind of a deceptive test in the sense that that's saying for GWAS. It is not saying necessarily family studies. It's not saying necessarily for synthetic biology, most significantly. So we know lots of ways to improve one or more cognitive tests in animals via synthetic biology, where you're not taking naturally occurring animal alleles and crossing them or anything like that. You're taking completely new things, overproduction of some particular gene, and also just allowing you to have youthful intellect later in life may not change your IQ a bit, but it definitely changes your ability to contribute to society. It changes your integrated intelligence over time, which also if you do GWAS and aging, that also doesn't show a big genetic effect, but that doesn't stop, most of the research showing progress in animal testing. It can be quite powerful, even though it doesn't vary within the animal populations.
Are you saying one of the common bottlenecks towards achieving both cognitive enhancement and longevity is measurement? So in the first place, how do we prove that we are having an effect? And if so, how do we solve that?
I don't really think it's a measurement problem. I mean, it is true that there's lots of different kinds of tests, and some of them are culturally biased, and we need to be very cautious of those when we're using it to make career decisions or educational decisions. But so those are some known problems with measurements. But, I think we have measures that can be applied with those caveats to see whether we're moving in the right direction, at least in animals. So measurement's one of the problem. Part of the problem is deciding what we want. Part of the problem is that these may be positive side effects of other things we're doing, like, you could have a cognitive component of a age reversal drug, and that since that wasn't the point, and it may take a while after the drug gets approved for one thing before you test it for the other thing. So even though the tests exist, they're not being applied yet. So I gave a few examples where there might be a cognitive effect if we were to test it. Just have to get around to it. It's not that we can't test it. It's just we haven't gotten around to it.
Fair enough. You mentioned genetic counseling. Let's talk about embryo selection for a minute. So, embryo selection using polygenic scores, even for things like IQ and height, is already happening today and commercially available. I know it's receiving mixed scientific reviews. In your opinion, is this going to have as significant or similarly significant contribution as, direct genetic interventions in humans?
So I think that perinatal, prenatal, IVF testing, and even earlier have uses beyond PRS, beyond polygenic risk scores, that are very well proven, preventing very serious single gene Mendelian diseases, Leishmanians or Tay-Sachs or that so forth. Those are things that you can do today at all of those stages. You can do something about them. Polygenic risk scores, I think, are maybe a little less impactful, but there's lots of medicine is not about life and death. In fact, huge fraction of the blockbuster drugs are not about life and death. And you could argue the main thing is that not be harmful, right? Do no harm, I think, is the thing. And I think the polygenic risk scores, as far as I know, are not doing harm, but it needs to be carefully regulated. So in other words, let's say that you have, what did you mention in addition to height? What was the other thing?
There is IQ and there is height.
Yeah.
By the way, if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We drop a new episode weekly, exploring how AI, biotech, and human enhancement are shaping the future. And if a friend would love this too, send it their way. It really helps us keep going. Now back to the pod.
So if you had parents will do all sorts of things in order to increase the chances of their children, having successful careers, and including early schooling. And if there is a test that helps, let's say 1%, plus or minus 10%, so it's 1% effect with this huge variation, I think parents will tend to take that because they wouldn't want to say they didn't use it, any advantage. And then with time, it will get better. It'll become a 2% effect with a 5% standard deviation. And even more parents will buy into that. Or they may not know the difference, because they don't want to take the time to sort out the statistics. But if a lot of their friends have sorted out the statistics, then they'll just, they'll go with the trend. So I think they will have an impact probably. But I think we really should get this going by focusing on the Mendelian diseases and as early as possible. I think IVF clinic is good in that it handles de novo mutations, things that happened recently in the germline of the parents. Principle, you can get some feeling for that by measuring the gametes without measuring the embryos. The embryos is the best, the highest quality way of making that decision. If you're talking about non-de novo mutations, things that are inherited from the mother and the father, there you can do it extremely early on. You can do it even before they've met their future spouse or gamete donor. And I think that's a very powerful method that's underappreciated. I mean, I think we're talking Mendelian disease alone affect 3% of people, which is an enormous number of people when you think that all cancers put together is about 13% of deaths. 3%, constitutes an equivalent amount to almost every type of cancer. So that we have a solution for. It's in the $100 range, and it's not being used. I mean, if it were being used, we would sequence all 8 billion people, or the ones that are reproductive age, and give them that information. Shouldn't affect their insurance whatsoever or their health benefits if they're in the countries where insurance is not the norm. Anyway, I think it's an opportunity for the healthcare providers and insurers to be the good guys, where they're giving information that could save lives of children that would die extremely young and painfully.
So you're saying Mendelian disease and risk scores is the potential way, and that then help onboard more people onto selection for this desirable trait where the effect size is very small now, but will continue increasing. And I suppose the truly powerful compounder would be if we start doing this over generations, then we're truly helping to guide evolution, basically.
Yeah, I mean, we're already impacting evolution by our marital choices and financial assistance programs and so forth. And who we give medicines to determines whether they will live to, through their reproductive years. So that's not the issue. And it's very slow, and there's such genetic diversity in our population that we're really not talking about gene pools. By the time we're talking about gene pools, we're going to have very advanced medicine, both generic and personalized. But yeah, I think it's not just single gene Mendelian and polygenic risk scores. There's things that are really in between, like, for example, 2 gene, but well-characterized Mendelian or modifier genes and so there's not some sharp cutoff where you say doesn't work and Mendelian does. Some Mendelian works extremely well, close to 100%. Another Mendelian doesn't. There are lots of 2 and 3 gene things that are not quite polygenic. Anyway, I think that as long as it does no harm, medicine is used, tip the scales in your favor, and that's what public health is about, as opposed to individual personalized health. Public health is to tip those scales. Not everybody has the same outcome, but on average, the outcome is better for society.
So we are already directing evolution by, as you said, choice is our partner. But if we started to do that, plus the embryo selection for every pregnancy, then we would really achieve potentially an exponential takeoff in whatever traits we could decide to optimize for.
I'm not sure it's exponential. It could be. I mean, during my life, I've been heavily involved in many exponentials, including computing and DNA reading and writing and so forth. It seems like there are exponentials everywhere. I think it would be sufficient to say that it would be dramatic. In the first generation, even, just the reduction, near elimination of the most serious diseases. It's interesting, the most serious diseases are actually the ones that are easy, and so therefore most likely have an impact for 2 reasons. They're serious and they're easy to predict.
Diseases aside, though, if we were talking purely about desirable traits such as intelligence, would we still be able to achieve this kind of exponential or semi-exponential takeoff via embryo selection across several generations, or would we likely run into some natural limitations rather fast?
I think embryo selection is very limited in its ability to get us outside of our species canyon, we're kind of in a rut with every species is in some kind of rut where, it's very unlikely that a bison is going to start flying just by selective mating, or a pig.
But it can start running faster by 5% every generation.
It could, yeah. And obviously at one point, a non-flying bird and mammal took to the air. But what's much more likely to happen sooner is humans took to the air. And we fly faster than any animal at this point, not because of selective mating or IVF or anything like that. It's because we are a technological culture and we can technologically change it. So I think that somatic changes and maybe germline will be much more impactful than trying to harness the natural variation. It's like I said, the natural variation hardly affects intelligence, but we know that intelligence is genetic because, we're more intelligent than corn plants as far as we know. So maybe that's a little abstract, but, synthetic biology can do all kinds of things that we cannot do by just breeding.
So you've also previously said that UAE have already 80% of citizens genome sequenced, which is about 100x higher than the average nation. So talking about adoption of these technologies, do you think geopolitical competition from places like this could become a strong contributing factor towards other places adopting this?
Absolutely. I'm an advisor to the UAE on this topic. I'm very proud of what they're doing. I think after they do all their citizens, they'll start doing non-citizens that want to participate, and they will be among the first countries to be relieved of certain disease burdens. Look forward to the first reports on how this, on their essentially what the public health impact of this is. But they're way ahead of other countries. They're not just way ahead of the average country, they're way ahead of the second highest country, which is, I don't know, either China or UK or something like that. United States will probably, it won't be the last, but we're definitely not going to be the first if we don't change something radically. And so UAE will not only get this health benefit almost immediately in the very next generation, in the current generation of babies, it will also get the advantage, the economic advantage of being the world's experts on this. Even if all the technologies were invented in the United States, even if, the technologies like next-gen sequencing and nanopores and CRISPR and so forth, even if those are mostly the United States, it doesn't mean that we're going to benefit from it. We're not the most advanced nation in healthcare, even though we spend more money than in most of the other nations. I think they will become experts that other countries will call upon. Eventually, the United States might call upon UAE as well. So it's great that we have this international diversity where one country can pull ahead of all the rest, and we can all watch, and maybe we'll decide that we don't like it, but it's going to happen in the next few years because they'll have 100% of their citizens sequenced, and there'll be public health studies.
Hopefully, it's a race to the top between individuals and between countries as well.
It's not even like you have to spend that. I agree. It's just race to the top, and it's not like there's money to be spent. I calculate you get somewhere between 10 and 100-fold return on investment for every genome you sequence. So you shouldn't think of it as, I have to spend $100 on every citizen. It's, I get $1,000 on every citizen that I sequence for $100. If countries could just figure that out, refine that calculation for their particular healthcare system, it's going to be tenfold in some countries, 100-fold in other countries, and figure out what it is for your country and figure out if that's enough, then it should be an easy decision. And you don't have to wait. Some people think, we sequence our people now, and they have to wait for the science to figure out how diseases work before you get our return on investment. No, you get your return on investment within 2 years, because a lot of people of reproductive age are going to have a child within 2 years, and that child has a 3% chance of having an incredibly serious disease that you can avoid. So it's not a net negative, even short term. It's a net positive short term. So I think it's just everybody's too busy to confirm my calculations, and the people that are suffering are 3% of the babies in the world.
You're saying eliminating the 3% of suffering gives us a 100x ROI? Or how does that calculation work?
Yeah. So your average cost, depends on the country and degree of inbreeding and so forth, is about $1 million per individual that has a severe Mendelian disease. Even though they die young, they're living longer and longer. They might make it to age 20 or something like that. A lot of them die before they're 4 years old. Anyway, it's about $1 million on average, and it's about $100 to do the diagnosis. Now, the $100 applies to lots of healthy people, so you have to amortize over that. So you end up, closer to 97% of the people you can spend the $100 and get nothing out of it. But 3%, you're going to get $1 million. And so it works out to about 100-fold improvement, return on investment.
Fair enough. So over the past decade, we've made a lot of progress, but to put my skeptics hat on for a second, we also had many genomics companies, including yours, that have raised hundreds of millions, in some cases IPO, and then stalled commercially or haven't quite delivered as expected. So I know it's hard to generalize, but overall, do you think maybe markets or maybe, people just got a bit ahead of themselves in terms of expectations? Was the tech a bit too early?
A little bit of it may be getting ahead, but I think it's mostly that new technologies require fine-tuning, debugging, economic business model adjustments and so forth. So it's just like engineering in general, pre-market engineering in their science, is you have to try a lot of things before you get something that will get you the next grant or get you the paper. I think Edison said it well. He wasn't proud of his one light bulb that worked. He was proud of the 1,000 that didn't work, right? I think it's a ridiculous argument that we should have none of our companies fail. And also, failure is different whether you're talking to the scientists or the investors. Investors feel a company fails if they don't get a twofold return on investment for a particular company because they've invested in a bunch of companies that have a 75% chance to fail. Anyway, they need a return on investment. Well, scientists, like me, might consider it a success if somebody buys that company pennies on the dollar and then goes running with it without maybe the original investors making anything, but maybe the next set do. So the important thing is society benefits, or at least that's what's important to a lot of scientists. So I think that some failures is a healthy sign. I mean, we obviously try to minimize failure, but in the end, you want to take some chances. The more radical the technology, the more you have to be willing to keep trying, be persistent.
I think every entrepreneur or everybody involved with invention is aware of that. And I think you also made a very good distinction between what's considered a financial success and a success for science or for society at large. And maybe there are some parallels with internet, early 2000s. A lot of companies raised too much money, went out of business, but a lot of infrastructure, fiber and such got built that then continues powering the internet for the next 25 years plus.
Yeah, that's a great example that you bring up. Yeah.
So you're saying this is potentially a similar scenario?
I think it's very similar. I mean, I think that both the individual investigators, like postdocs in my lab, and society at large is pretty tolerant of a failure in the financial sense. But overall, after trend line, there's very few technologies that people are willing to give up. And they're certainly unwilling to go back in time for all the technologies. So, make some omelets, crack some eggs, it's reasonable. And I think we're getting better at reducing risks. I think in particular, we want to get better at reducing risk for FDA approval because that will shorten the time. We've gotten now one that was done in 7 months. I think the next baby with a severe N1 disease might happen in 4 months. And then lots of diseases in adults might get approved and debugged in 4 months. That's one of the motivations for reducing the error rate. But it doesn't apply to every technology. There are technologies that don't affect life and death where higher error rate is tolerable. We just don't want to have failure is not an option when human lives are at stake, but it's certainly an option when you're doing preclinical or not yet in humans. Or non-clinical things that are, completely, fun and games or transportation or, anything that is a low lethality.
So with the benefit of hindsight, if we were founding WordRipe or Veritas today, would you do anything different?
Well, probably not, because I wouldn't just be doing WordRipe and Veritas, right? I mean, the number of metabolic engineering companies like WordRipe, it was focused on harvesting, 120,000 genomes from bacteria, actinomycetes, which are responsible for most of the blockbuster drugs in history. That was a valuable contribution when we found lots of polyketide synthase clusters and maybe inspired other companies to do copycat things. I'm not opposed to copycat as long as you don't blatantly infringe on hard-won intellectual property. And then for Veritas, we tried a lot of experiments simultaneously because we don't know what the right business model is for providing this valuable information I spoke about earlier, where you get 100-fold return on investment. That argument alone is not adequate. Bringing the price down from $3 billion to $300 is not adequate, or $100. So we tried Genome and 23andMe. I helped start both of those about the same time. Genome's price point was $350,000 for a pretty high quality whole genome sequence in 2008-ish, and 23andMe, that was, I think, a little over $1,000, and quickly dropping to $99. And now they're about the same price, whole genome sequencing and SNP, just sparse common SNPs. Genomes was another attempt at creating a marketplace of genomics. Nebula, so it keeps going, and it interacts with all the startups I helped with that made the next gen sequencing that all the direct-to-consumer or direct-to-physician organizations did. And they're more specialized products that aren't just about whole genome, but they're selective cancer-related genes, GRAIL, and so forth. You have to think of the entire collection as to whether you have a success or not.
The direct-to-consumer sequencing space seems like a very interesting case study because, as you have said, we have brought the cost down, 100,000-fold, but more than that if we look from the start. But despite that, so many of these companies are still struggling for some reason to find a commercially viable business model.
The obvious one from my point of view is Mendelian diseases. It's $1 million risk, $100 to $200 prevention. Just because it makes sense on paper to a few individuals doesn't mean it makes sense paper on, that are making the decisions, or to the consumers that are also making some of the decisions. So it will take time. It may take one country demonstrating where the government knows the benefits. They don't have to convince an insurance company. They don't have to convince the consumers. All they have to do is what our government public health policy is. It's just like some countries embraced HIV public health measures and other countries said, no, HIV doesn't cause AIDS. Wildly different public health policies, and then the world gets to see which ones work and which ones don't.
It seems like a very interesting game, convincing individual consumers to make rational choices for themselves. So on one hand, you mentioned how impactful sequencing would be to eliminate Mendelian diseases, and not that many people care right now. On the other hand, we have got the direwolf moment, which really broke the internet. Everybody relates to it immediately and is impactful, but it's arguably less relevant to the individual life of everyday people.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. The direwolf breaks the internet, and something that could really benefit society takes a long time. And I've worked on both of them, and I can see society's interaction with both of them. I think part of the reason that we engage in things society is interested in is to bring them into the conversation. What some of my colleagues talk about, we want to bring the public into the conversation, but then they'll only talk about their latest extremely abstract breakthrough that has no connection. So I think we have to meet the public where they want to meet in part, but there are also things where you don't have to convince the public to make rational decisions. They continue to make random decisions or irrational, doesn't, by somebody's standards, because those decisions are essentially being made by the marketplace in some way that doesn't involve each individual understanding what they're doing. So, for example, a lot of the decisions that go into what's inside your cell phone, they're very technical decisions, and they're made by experts in the technology. They aren't necessarily experts in social engineering, but that's what they're doing. And, I'm not making when I first saw the first electronic camera and the first cell phone, I said, wow, it'd be great to put those two together. But the fact that whether that was a rational consumer choice or not, there was nothing to choose from. There was no such device at the time. And it depended upon some technical person and some marketing person agreeing that it should be done. It didn't involve my rational decision or somebody next to me who said, cell phones are going to melt my brain. And so I don't want a camera or a cell phone next to my brain. So all the decision making at the consumer level was ignored. And basically they brought out, smartphones, and that was a gigantic hit. So I think that's going to be true time and again, is that we're going to be making technological decisions by a messy process where technologists that don't necessarily have the big picture are making decisions that then we vote on it because we see its practical advantages. And a lot of those things that people get very excited about, the things that go viral, are completely not life and death. If it's life and death, there's some life and death things where people either exaggerate their importance or they diminish their importance. So for example, terrorism historically was very small effect on public health, but or flesh-eating bacteria, very small impact, but people, obsess about those sorts of things, while they don't worry so much about malaria and tuberculosis and heart disease that kill lots of people. So the apportionment of funds is not necessarily directly related to the quality of life, quality adjusted life years.
Terrorism is a very good counterexample because it's very sudden and publicly visible, even if it's statistically much less significant than Mendelian diseases. Do you think we need to and we can engineer a direwolf type of moment for things like sequencing?
I think we may have already and didn't notice it. I think the set of forces that resulted in the UAE getting 80% of its citizenry and soon 100% sequenced may have been that moment. That viral moment. It just wasn't globally viral. In fact, the direwolf was probably not globally viral. There was probably a lot of countries who who cares? We got, lots of stray dogs in my village. Who cares? Right. But it just takes a little while to get that feedback. It's like even the first smartphone prototype, people might have said, yeah, I like a keyboard. I like the little chiclets on it. I'm not going to use something that doesn't have any place for my fingers to go. Ended up being wrong from a market acceptance standpoint. So it's very empirical and it takes time. I think when we think of how long it takes for the longest technologies to get adopted, pathetically short, when we look back on it from, 100 years from now, we'll say, wow, that was pretty fast. The Pony Express, that was instituted and deconstructed in, I don't know, a couple of years. I mean, it really was, a lot of technologies are just quickly brought in and they do their thing and they're useful and then they're replaced quickly after that. And I think that's going to be true for Mendelian diseases and gene therapies, aging, all these things we're going to look back and say that was fast.
By 2040, what enhancement that sounds radical today will feel completely normal?
I would say probably AI. Science AI, I think that's going to be the biggest success story. People will barely even notice that it's happening. It's just that suddenly drugs are getting approved faster. They're failing less. So that'll be the scientific AI. And then the conversational AI is already having an impact. Is I think that people, it may contribute both to disinformation but also ultimately, I think anyone who wants information will be augmented. They want the facts, and the facts generally result in better health, better investment, just better quality of life in general. So I think those two things for AI will be the revolution that we see right now. I mean, we're not blind to it. It'll be even more profound in 2040 and all the health benefits that come from AI.
So when we talk about scientific AI, just so I understand the mechanism by which it yields a vastly larger number of drugs, is it because we can simulate things much better and we eliminate the number of things that we have to actually test, or what's the mechanism?
Yeah, well, there's a few related to what you said. Is we can't simulate everything yet, but what we can do is let's say if we're making a lot of protein drugs, we can bias them towards things that fold properly. Even if that's the only thing we did, that would greatly reduce the pipeline that we need to get a blockbuster. But in addition to just folding, we can also improve the probability that they're aiming at the target that we want. We can improve their serum stability and so forth. All these things are subject to AI improvement. And kind of like polygenic risk score that we were talking about earlier, that doesn't have to be perfect because we can now make big libraries, which I think is kind of a form of artificial intelligence, a form of quantum computing where you're actually making things that are quantum precise. We're actually making the drug and we're testing the drug animal, and we can now test millions of gene therapies simultaneously in a primate, which normally, I don't even think anybody's ever done a million primate preclinical trial, but now it's routine, at least for things like immunological surveillance and tissue tropism, where the drug goes and where it persists. So that's an honorary member of the growing AI set of tools. If you can synthesize lots of potential solutions and test them in the real world, then your accuracy shoots up to 100% because you're using the actual drug in the actual, or as close to actual organism as possible. Yeah, so I think that's happened. That revolution is superimposed on the AI revolution, is greatly increasing scientific artificial intelligence.
So AI can help us design a larger number of candidates, which we can then synthesize faster, and we can test them simultaneously. And those things combined yield this exponential revolution.
So like Therapies has done millions of tests in primates. Geneticist, our organ transplant company, can test organs in decedent humans where they've got the permission of the family to have one last contribution of the individual after they're brain dead. You could imagine putting those two together where you can test millions of things in a decedent human, and then you really are getting close to 100% accuracy, where both the therapeutic and the test situation is equal to a real clinical setting. But in a real clinical setting, you're not normally testing 1 million in one patient, although that might happen too. because there might be circumstances where you can do multiplexing in a severely diseased person who's not brain dead, or even in a healthy individual. If we get good enough at predicting toxicity and efficacy, it's much more accurate to test it in a whole human than in a whole primate or in a partial human like an organoid.
How many years away are we from this de facto 100% accuracy?
Well, yeah, I mean, primates are close, but they're not 100%. Human organoids are close, but they're not an integrated system where you have the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system all working together with the liver and so forth. I think we're already there. I mean, we could do it tomorrow. We just need to have the right medical emergency, the right medical case where someone is going to die very soon, and you have to try a lot of things out before they die, and you have reason to believe that all the things you want to try out are not going to exacerbate where the rewards outweigh the risks. It's never about zero risk. It's about the benefits outweighing the risk. So I think it's just a matter of time before we try a million different drugs at once in one patient.
Don't such cases already exist today, or what would constitute such a case?
I don't know of a case where a patient has received a million different, let's say, barcoded drugs. They have to be barcoded to know which one works.
I mean, not received by case where the risk-reward ratio justifies us trying this.
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, for example, monoclonals, big category of blockbuster drugs. And the very first set of tests on monoclonals, the first 4 patients, all of them almost died. Harm was done, but they moved quickly enough to save those 4 and to prevent the study expanding. So that happens all the time. There are lots of clinical trials where people die. Sometimes it's because they were going to die anyway, and it's just hard to tell whether they died because of the treatment or because they were going to die anyway. But we want to minimize that. We want to really reduce that.
So we already have instances that justify this risk-reward ratio. We already have the technology to try a million different things in a human patient at the same time. So then what's stopping us from putting those 2 things together today?
You just need a disease, probably, that doesn't have a solution with the conventional methods. So a few decades back, conventional wisdom was one highly purified small molecule drug at a time. That was it. Your clinical trial cannot be more complicated than that. And then it expanded to not one pure crystalline compound, but something that might be a protein, which is somewhat heterogeneous because the proteins are not perfectly synthesized. They have about a 10 to the minus 3 error rate in their polymers. Could be an antibody and so forth. And so you're testing a mixture there, but you have kind of a good approximation. It's not a mixture. And then you start doing intentional mixtures, like I mentioned earlier about polypharmacy, where you say, okay, these drugs work separately. Let's try them together. But it's not guaranteed to work. They could interfere with one another. They could cause a synthetic toxic event. And then the next step is to test lots of drugs together where none of them have proven safe and effective, but you have reason to expect them to be. Maybe they've been safe and effective in animals. And then the next step is we don't even have to go through animal testing. We go straight, and we don't have to do organoids. We're so competent that we can do multiplex, non-toxic testing. But I would say that we're not the most complex mixtures I've seen, except maybe organ transplants. That's extremely complex mixture of gene edits and foreign substances. But most of it's polypharmacy for diseases that evolve real time while you're sick: cancer, infectious diseases, and viruses.
If you had unlimited funding and you could choose to unlock one technological bottleneck across any of the projects that we discussed today, which one would it be?
Well, it depends on how you want to spend it. So I would say that synthesizing mammalian genomes, pig and human, would be a huge breakthrough, be very beneficial. And we're working on that. I think that if you just wanted to spend the money and you just offered everybody on the planet free genome sequencing, might work. But I think that we brought the price down from $3 billion for a haploid genome to sort of $100 for a high quality diploid genome. That didn't seem to do it. So bringing it from 100 down to 0, I'm not sure that would help. So that just, again, I think you just have to wait until people do the slow public health analyses. But maybe you could fund those public health analyses. I don't know. What else? Synthesis would be impactful, not just to make.
What would that unlock for us?
Well, for example, you could synthesize pig genome that replaces the current ones that would be not require immune suppressants because there's no antigens. You've solved the tolerance problem by making essentially an identical twin, as all of the things that would cause rejection have been replaced genome-wide. The little protein coding exons for all the key exons that would be rejected. You could also make it multivirus resistant. So we've proven at least one organism we can make it resistant to all naturally occurring viruses that we've tested, and probably all, period. That we would like to do that in pigs as well, so that the organs would be multivirus resistant. All the things that we want to do with endangered species and extinct species would be far easier to do if we could just knock off 100 different shots on goal for hybrid genomes that would have different combinations of traits. And also that kind of synthetic capability could be used for smaller things as well. You could make gene therapies where you have 200 genes in a herpes virus rather than one gene in a AAV, which is a tiny little vector, while cytomegalovirus is 200 plus kilobases. And you can make millions of them. Like I said, we currently test millions, but it'd be hard to make millions of 200 kb constructs. So those are things that would benefit from additional money. But, it's coming. The money is coming in one way or another. No matter what mistakes one individual government might make, it's compensated for by other governments doing it very efficiently. And the whole world gets to see which method wins.
So you laid out a very optimistic vision for the future of biotech, and I'm optimistic as well. I guess just lastly, to be devil's advocate for a second, what would need to happen from here on, or what would need to go wrong for us to stagnate and not unlock or not continue climbing this exponential curve of these unlocks that we discussed?
Well, the surest way, not necessarily the most likely way, but a way that, if it happened, would probably result in stagnation, would be anything that disrupts social order. Could be, an asteroid, it could be terrible global economic policy, anything that causes unrest in the streets globally, not just locally, would have the consequence that economic downturn, any luxury would disappear, and science in times of disruption is a luxury. I don't think it's a luxury in general. It's a necessity if we're going to avoid existential risks long term, like asteroids and super volcanoes and solar flares and whatnot. It's going to be science and technology that eventually saves all of the species of Earth from extinction. Did that answer your question or no?
I think it does, and maybe that's a good place to land this conversation.
Thank you.
This has been great. Thank you.